maybe we can get started. We're not too bad, 10 minutes behind schedule, which in the conferences I attend, that's kind of being ahead of schedule. But we're going to, there's a panel that will last for the next hour and a half, responding to a national crisis, disaster, and loss. And, you know, in listening to Jim Abelson this morning, who spoke for 10 or 15 minutes, and John's comments, and you'll hear these panelists, that every single person who's here could inform us for hours about what it is that they do and the knowledge that they have on the topics that we're dealing with over these days. So this is like a buffet, but you're only allowed one spoonful from the. So it makes me hungry to learn more. That Iman Yahoo Hindi will not be here this morning. He apologized because of health issues, and that's unfortunate because clearly at least every single person that I've heard has a tremendous amount to say, but at least the positive side of that is that the panel will, instead of having the allotted 15 minutes that we were going to give them, they'll each have 20 minutes, and I'm going to try and keep folks reasonably on time, because I think that this being a panel, the most important thing would really be to get feedback from them on the questions and issues that that impact you or that you're curious about. But again, you know, I'm not going to be that strict, because what they have to say is really just so interesting if you just look at the titles of the talks. So I'm going to introduce the people as they come up, not all three at once or four at once, because Reg and Bonnie are going to do a tag team. They've been doing tag teams for as long as I've known them. But the first person, lessons learned from Oklahoma City, 1995 to 2006, is Dr. Phebe Tucker, who's professor and vice chair of education and director of psychiatry and anxiety research clinic at the University of Oklahoma Health Sciences Center. Prior to medical school, she received a BA in English literature from UC Berkeley, and then taught in the Peace Corps in Ivory Coast, Australia, and California. Where else do you go from UC Berkeley but to the Peace Corps, at least? That's what I think. After training in medicine and psychiatric residency at the University of Oklahoma, she joined the faculty there in 1989, and her career has focused on teaching and conducting research on post-traumatic stress disorder and neurobiological assessments of anxiety disorders. Dr. Tucker has treated and studied direct survivors of the Oklahoma City bombing since 1995 to better understand terrorism's consequences. Dr. Tucker.
I really appreciate being here. If you can't hear me, just raise your hand. And it's kind of like going back in history. It's almost 11 years now. It seems like just yesterday. I remember distinctly being in my office with a psychiatry trainee, a resident, in supervision, and we felt the floor shake, heard a loud boom, and having grown up in the Bay Area, as you've just heard, I assumed it was an earthquake. But you know, there aren't too many faults in Oklahoma. They are not very active. But my resident was from Bosnia, actually, and was a refugee. She knew immediately that it was an explosion. Everybody kind of left their offices, someone turned on a TV, and this is the scene that we saw as a traffic helicopter went overhead and took photos of our federal building in ruins and smoking. And so from that day on began a series of experiences and lessons I think that we'll never forget for those of us that responded and also for our community members. So all of the medical personnel, and that would include medical students, residents, faculty, and staff, were asked or required to either present to our hospital, University Hospital, or to be ready to receive the injured that were expected to come. And most of the severely injured ended up at St. Anthony's Hospital downtown, but University received a fair number of injured folks. And from that time on, individuals kind of scattered, did different things, kind of in response to the controlled chaos that existed. And this is a quote from one of my medical students as I was teaching about PTSD later. He shared with me that he had been a firefighter trainee during the federal building bombing downtown, and he jumped up like many and responded. I was 18 years old, had 6 months of training, and all I could see was this huge piece of concrete swinging in the breeze on a tiny piece of steel. Someone started screaming, "There's another bomb." At that moment I thought, that's it. I'm not going to make it out of this. I didn't even find anyone alive. I was supposed to be a lifesaver, not a coroner. Well, my student wanted to talk to all of his students, 150, and I thought, I don't know, that's a good idea. He's kind of revealing himself to his peers. But he did, and he was the best lecturer, I think, that we ever had in human behavior. He shared with his students about his experiences with PTSD and depression after the bombing, and the fact that for him one of the most difficult things was the emotional numbing and the lack of connection that he felt from his loved ones until he recovered. And so we think about the effects of, as we've heard many times, on the helpers. And actually, it is helpful to conceptualize Wright, who described response to an Air Force disaster at Ganders. And she thought of exposure to disasters in a disaster community as consisting of different concentric circles, with those in the interior having more exposure and so forth until we get outside to the outside community. So when we talk about students or faculty or community members who respond in a community, we have to remember that they are part of a traumatized community, and so here they're both rescue workers and community members, and so they may experience additional distress. In the Oklahoma City bombing, about 1,000 people were physical casualties, and that doesn't include those who were bereaved. So over 800 were injured and 168 killed, including children. So for our small community, that was significant. And this was a typical scene in the street afterwards. Carol North's probably done the most extensive studying of what happened after the bombing, and this look at direct survivors with over 80% injured showed that about a third developed PTSD, and almost 25%, between a quarter and a fifth, had depression. There was not any increase in alcohol use, but there was a baseline alcohol use problem. So female sex injuries, those who had friends injured or killed or who had prior diagnoses were more at risk, and that's consistent with most of our trauma work. And so from this point on, people, as I said, kind of scattered. Many of our faculty and residents and some students went to the Family Notification Center that was run by the Red Cross. And there, teams of one representative from the medical examiner's office, one mental health professional, and a clergyman in one team worked with the family, told them that their loved ones were killed, that their remains had been identified, and notified the family that although they could not access the remains of their loved ones because of health problems, that they could perhaps have some objects that belonged to them, and any common tissue would be in a common grave. So, that was a very distressing time for all, and I think we were very glad for the clergy being on the team because they had the most experience with acute grief. And some faculty and trainees went to hospitals, worked with the injured and families. Some worked with acute grief, etc. And I had the privilege of working with the pathology residents who were involved in the approximate 2-week process of identifying remains, gathering forensic evidence. And in working with them, they all kind of denied being greatly distressed at the time, although they did say that working with the bodies of children was particularly distressing to them. We were able to conduct a survey, a mail-in survey, a couple of years later, so we looked at retrospective responses in body handlers, and we had about almost a 40% response rate. And as sometimes happens in a large disaster with a lot of death, relatively large amount of death, in a small community, you don't have enough medical examiners. So many people jumped up and offered to help who had little experience. And so some were medical students, some dental students and residents, pathology residents, etc. Some had gross anatomy and felt that, maybe they had something to offer. I think it's significant to note that almost 30% of these body handlers knew someone who was killed or killed. And so if they were aware of it at the time, they would be aware that somewhere in the remains were the remains of their friends. And I think, people have talked about how identification with the victim can be very difficult for body handlers. And so we asked an open-ended question on the survey, what were distressing memories for you? And when you ask an open-ended question, you get incredible answers. And so many of the answers focused on the difficulty identifying remains of children and then the smells and sights because of decomposing bodies. So this shows that the vast majority, 65%, had absolutely no medical examiner experience. About 20% were seasoned medical examiners, and then we had the range in between. And so you might think, oh, these folks are doomed. However, we'll see in a moment that was not necessarily the case. Their physical exposure was consistent with being at the medical school, which was about a mile away, so everyone kind of felt and heard the explosion, or most people did. And again, many knew someone injured and killed. But we were actually quite surprised and gratified to see that the PTSD and depressive symptoms were at the level or even below the level of endorsing items at almost never experienced. And that that was right after the bombing, retrospectively. And then they retrospectively reported that a year later they were significantly improved. So certainly not what we expected. And as we looked at coping mechanisms, many used social support, cognitive reframing, distracting techniques, and attending memorial services. So what explained this resilience? For us, it wasn't certain. We couldn't really tease it out in the little survey, but there was a tremendously strong sense of community and support. Also, the chief medical examiner was charismatic, very caring, and set a lot of comfort around for his people. And it's been said by many folks that when one assumes a professional role, puts on that hat, that may have a protective element as well. But we did note that among body handlers who reported more problems, those who said that they increased their use of alcohol had more medical problems afterwards or sought mental health care and apparently needed it, did have more symptoms. So we want to kind of target those folks in the future among body handlers. And actually, our governor realized pretty quickly that we probably needed to protect the direct survivors, because many journalists and many researchers from all over kind of descended upon Oklahoma City and wanted to, try to contact survivors and study them. And so the governor and our IRB recognized that we really want to protect the survivors from re-traumatization. However, it did become more challenging to conduct legitimate research as well, and we often had to appear before the board. They kind of got to know us by first name. But one of the groups that we studied was part of an outreach program to the Asian community. And these individuals had very little physical or emotional exposure to the bombing in terms of they did not lose very many people that they knew or very many people that they knew were injured. However, when we looked at their symptoms of post-traumatic stress, we found that many had pretty high levels of post-PTSD symptoms, as high as a group of highly exposed individuals who sought mental health treatment 6 months after the bombing. And so when we tried to figure out what was going on, and we looked at prior trauma that they experienced, all but 4 had been involved in significant disaster or trauma in their countries of origin, a lot of it political trauma or war. So we felt that was important, and when we analyzed the data, the PTSD symptoms from the bombing corresponded to PTSD symptoms reported from their other trauma in their countries of origin, and also with age, so that those who were older now in Oklahoma City, or who were younger when they were traumatized in their prior life, were more likely to have PTSD symptoms. And so that told us, don't assume that a segment of the community that's not highly impacted is not affected. So programs were set up to try to help these individuals. Now, we have followed the victims over time, and we did a study with Dr. Pfefferbaum, Betty Pfefferbaum, who's very active with children, and with Carol North. So we assessed direct survivors from Carol North's original group 6.5 to 7 years later. And what we were wanting to look at was the biological footprints of trauma and disaster, and also what was happening emotionally with these folks. So we looked at blood pressure and heart rate responses to a very non-invasive interview about the bombing. And then we looked at PTSD and depressive symptoms. And again, we were somewhat surprised and happy to see that the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder and the IESR and symptoms of depression on the Beck were below levels that were considered clinically relevant, actually, again, at the almost never level. However, the PTSD symptoms were higher for our direct survivors than for community controls who were not exposed. And then I think the surprising thing for us was when we compared that biological reactivity, and what we saw was in our direct survivors, even though they appeared to be either recovered or resilient emotionally, they had a significant increase in their heart rate and systolic and diastolic blood pressures during that interview. And it was greater than that of the controls. The controls had some elevation, but far less than our survivors. And so what we thought was, direct survivors, even many, many years later, at least this subset appeared to show some resilience, some emotional health. But on the other hand, they were very biologically reactive to the reminders of trauma, at least autonomically reactive. And so, why is this? How can it be that someone who reports that they're doing well emotionally would have this physical response? One suggestion is it may be part of, they may have been healed or healing, but that at the same time they may be prepared in a way to meet a future disaster, to get up and to respond. Another possibility is that this biological reactivity might contribute to avoidance problems, distress, or even somatic problems, healthcare seeking, or possibly vulnerability to cardiovascular issues later if they have the genetic tendency. So what we've learned then over the years in Oklahoma City is that after a significant disaster, every disaster is different. Our community was intact, fortunately, but many community members in our intact community jumped up and offered to help. And this included students, volunteers, etc. And we don't want to discourage people in a disaster community from helping. I think the Red Cross has a wonderful idea. Give anybody something to do that they can handle. Give them a job. Keep them busy. I think that can be very helpful. But we have to remember that students or anyone who responds in a disaster community is part of this traumatized community. We should take care of and not reactivate prior trauma. And as I look back in that family notification center, I recall a resident actually had a coordinating role, very good resident. She did well. She received and got support well and had no residual problems. A medical student, on the other hand, who kind of on her own went down and offered to help and spent a lot of time there, developed symptoms of acute stress disorder. And what she confided in me was that a prior trauma that she had had early in her life was reactivated by this. So she, needed some help afterwards. So again, prior trauma I think we need to be cautious with. Also, as we've heard, always make sure that people's basic needs are met and that we provide non-intrusive follow-up care as needed. And, mental health issues for some may persist for years. In Oklahoma City, we've seen a continuum. Some individuals have done very well, and some on the other end of the continuum are disabled and have more psychopathology. So we must be ready to meet the mental health needs for some over long term. And I think, as we've heard so many times yesterday and today, it's so important to understand resilience and why some people do so well when you expect that they've been so traumatized that they shouldn't. And so we hope to contribute more of our research looking at resilience and looking at risk factors. So those are our lessons. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tucker. Our next speaker on the panel, who will be talking on the human response to disasters, the who, what, and why of helping and getting help, is Dr. Craig Katz, who's medical director of the World Trade Center Work Volunteer Mental Health Monitoring and Treatment Program at Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York City. And the center meets the mental health needs of people who worked or volunteered at Ground Zero after 9/11. He has previously served as the director of acute care psychiatric services at Mount Sinai, and he's co-founder of the Disaster Psychiatry Outreach in 1998, which is a charitable organization devoted to the provision of voluntary psychiatric assistance to people affected by disasters. Dr. Katz?
Good morning. I'm going to try to do this without slides. Thank you for this opportunity to talk with you. I'm going to talk to you a bit about 9/11, at least from the perspective of our organization, Disaster Psychiatry Outreach, to which Dr. Silk just referred. A little bit of background about DPO and a little bit about 9/11, and I'll try to draw a few lessons as far as I can from our work as it relates to college campuses. We founded Disaster Psychiatry Outreach back in 1998, as Dr. Silk said, as an organization devoted to using volunteer psychiatrists to help people in the aftermath of disaster. And 9/11, of course, occurred. We're from New York, right in our backyard, nothing that we'd ever imagined, but just a little other background. We, over the years, have responded to a number of different disasters, pre and post 9/11, including several aviation disasters, the 2001 El Salvador earthquakes, the tsunami in Sri Lanka last year, most recently Hurricane Katrina. But in terms of 9/11, I'll give you a little bit of a story of our involvement. DPO existed for about 2.5 years prior to 9/11, and at that point was a small organization, mostly composed of ourselves as the founders and the spirits of the organization, and meeting primarily in my living room for many, many meetings, trying to plan out how we would respond to a disaster from a mental health perspective. And when 9/11 struck, we'd had some disaster experience around which we were able to base our protocols and our plan, and we were as ready as one can be under those circumstances. And partly, as an important lesson, we were ready because we had spent years developing relationships with the local Department of Mental Health and the American Red Cross, and also a very important organization called Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. And a lot of that networking permitted us to do the work that we did. Prior to 9/11, we were like a hearty band of, I'd say, a dozen of us, and that would be a generous number. But after 9/11, supported by a much-needed infusion of funds, permitting us to finally hire full-time staff, and also just an incredible outpouring of volunteers. We went from a dozen of us doing this all on our own to about 700 psychiatrists who volunteered their time between September 12th, 01 and April 02 to our volunteer efforts related to 9/11, and I'll tell you a little bit about those. In the immediate 2.5 months after 9/11, DPO worked at the Family Assistance Center in New York City, which was the primary center set up by the City of New York to provide services to family members, survivors, and others who were affected by 9/11, and they were many. It initially was housed in the Lexington Avenue Armory, where the National Guard usually trains. It was very hastily and actually quite impressively set up within about a day, actually. And then about a week later moved over to Pier 94 on the Hudson River, which is this enormous cavernous structure usually used for things like trade shows, acres long, and in that were housed all sorts of services for survivors, legal services, things related to criminal justice, how to obtain benefits, of course, how to find out about missing loved ones, and in all that, mental health played a role. Thanks to the Department of Mental Health, DPO had a booth right there amid all that, not too far from the American Red Cross, our other partners, where we were able to do our work from basic day 2, really, from September 12th, 01. And at the Family Assistance Center, our psychiatrists performed any number of activities. Initially, in particular, being involved as sort of in not what you would not consider classic psychiatric roles, and it reminds me of what Dr. Abelson, I think it was, earlier on said about being a sensible helper, doing what needs to be done. And for psychiatry in particular, I think it's useful to do things that need to be done, because in the process, you can be a sort of psychiatric fly on the wall and do psychiatry on the fly. And in our case, early on, we participated in reviewing notification lists with family members that were coming and looking to see could their family member have wound up in one of the city hospitals, or were they perhaps known or found in any way, or just displaced. We also participated in helping the local police, the NYPD, do DNA collections, which were necessary and pretty gruesome and awful task at that point, from family members bringing in combs, etc., personal belongings from family members in order to aid the identification process. And we participated alongside of or solely in these processes, and it gave us an opportunity to also see how people were doing and to provide them with a little bit of psychoeducation in the process. And that's what we did initially. Quite quickly, our role evolved into a much more standard role for psychiatrists, which was evaluating people. And initially, in the first 2 weeks, we saw about 40 people a day in the Family Assistance Center in its 2 different incarnations. And ultimately, by the time we closed shop at the Family Assistance Center by around Thanksgiving, did what we call full consultations for about 1,000 people. And also, in that process, doing triaging, providing some symptom relief, including prescribing short-term supplies of anti-anxiety and sleep medication, which we think were a crucial part of what we had to offer, and also referring people for ongoing care. And in very rare instances, and they were rare, referring people for psychiatric hospitalization, although there were a few such cases. At the same time, we worked with the Red Cross and set up what we called a Kids Corner, and using donations of stuffed animals and sofas, and made a nice sort of soft, plush place that kids could come to, particularly when they were being brought in by the parents, that we could tend to their mental health needs in a more child-friendly atmosphere. And our psychiatrists work with paraprofessionals for the many weeks that we were there helping with that process. So as I said, over time we did about 1,000 such evaluations, in many cases referring people on for ongoing care. Our role in that immediate response was not to engage people in ongoing treatment and ongoing relationships necessarily. It was a 1 or perhaps in some cases 2 times deal in meeting with people. We did have about 5,000 or 6,000 brief encounters, which were more anonymous and more based on support rather than doing an outright psychiatric evaluation for people, and did similarly in the Kids Corner. We also had the opportunity to work down at Ground Zero, and it took a lot longer to get involved at Ground Zero because of all the security concerns down there and the safety concerns. But ultimately, we're able to deploy about 60 or 70 psychiatrists doing a very different, unique, uncommon version of psychiatry, wearing hard hats and respirator masks, having what were largely informal encounters that would come up around someone asking you for a cigarette, or at a security checkpoint, or in the various cafeterias that were set up there, or among rescue workers who were taking a break. Informal encounters, very different, just checking in, seeing how guys are doing. Many of these conversations would go from brief to long conversations about their various concerns for their own safety, wondering how their families were doing, which was an issue for many of them who were working days on end without much break, or not really even leaving the site, missing their coworkers who were lost in the attack if they were uniformed services. And we did that sort of work at Ground Zero for many weeks, until actually it was concluded that it was becoming too dangerous of a site because of all the heavy equipment for us to be there. That particular work, I think, leaves us with a lot of questions about what we accomplished by being there. Did we need to be psychiatrists doing that? Was that more of a humanitarian effort? I think we did, but I think it helped certainly to be psychiatrists, but that was the kind of work we did then. So all that was in the initial couple of months after 9/11, and then over time, and by the spring of 2002, we had a desire to at least follow up with the people that we saw in full contact at the Family Assistance Center, which again were about 1,000 people. For about 600 of them, we had adequate contact information to call them. And we thought this was important to do, again, because we saw most of these people for once, twice, and we wanted to see how they were doing and if they needed any services. And we actually relied on donated phone banks from the UJA and FEMA to do this. Those basic findings were, this was not done for scientific purposes, this was done for clinical purposes. Some people were doing just fine. Many people, it was amazing to me, were literally still paralyzed, or even more so paralyzed by their symptomatology at that point. And a striking number of people weren't even at that phone number in residence anymore, which spoke to me about the potential displacement that could be caused by any kind of disaster, even when homes themselves aren't necessarily physically destroyed. And then in the late spring of 2002, we had the opportunity to establish a program that Dr. Silk alluded to, that I still serve as medical director for, and that is a program to attend to the mental health needs of rescue workers and volunteers from Ground Zero. And the brief history of that is the CDC established a medical screening program for the workers who were down there that would be focused on their upper and lower airways, because there was concern for the so-called World Trade Center cough and what would be the medical aftermath for those who participated. The CDC also, but a major part of what they did was not going to be mental health. They threw in some questions about mental health that they wanted the occupational physicians to ask, but it was really a bit of a token effort, and nothing that I think any mental health professional would be satisfied was adequate. We had the opportunity to seek private funding through disaster psychiatry outreach in my department of psychiatry at Mount Sinai, and in a joint effort established a screening program that was initially supposed to be just 1 year long, looking at all these various workers as they were coming in for their medical screening to see how they were doing mental health-wise. And that program, again, was supposed to be 1 year. I never expected that I'd still be doing this many years out. And the program actually is still going and will continue through at least December '07, and we think we'll need to go on further. But over time, we've screened about 10,000 workers, volunteers, and these are not just uniformed services. These are construction workers, communication workers, Red Cross volunteers, some of our own disaster psychiatry outreach volunteers who were down at Ground Zero, and have found, you know, again, ours is not a research study. It is a clinical program, but varying rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, major depression, various shapes and sizes of clinical depression, anxiety that don't, I think, always lend themselves to a perfect DSM-IV diagnosis, and certainly alcohol use problems. Many problems with work performance, relationships, personal relationships, marital problems. These are all the various issues that we are still dealing with in these many rescue workers and over time. And as I said, we've evaluated about 10,000. We're still seeing new people coming in. And at any one time, we have about 500 people in treatment, because one of our problems initially was you set up this program and you identify need. What are you going to do with all these people? Many of whom are male, not your traditional seekers of mental health services. Most of whom have never gone to a mental health professional before in their lives. But we were able to establish an in-house treatment program that's free, that provides medications and/or psychotherapy to these guys, mostly guys, some women, and that is ongoing as we speak. So that's just a little bit about our 9/11 activities, and I want to just draw a few, I think, lessons learned for you, and I may actually go under my 20 minutes, which maybe you'll all be grateful for. Just a few points, and I'll let you draw your own conclusions and or ask questions afterwards. And many of these points, I think, have been echoed already this morning, and I gather in hearing the summary of yesterday were already stated yesterday, but I think if they're being repeated, there's a reason for that. First point that I would make, drawing from our experiences, is that pre-disaster planning is crucial. And among the various things that you need to do pre-disaster is actually take a look at your capacity to provide mental health services post-disaster. And what I mean by that is if you're going to have people who are identified as being your disaster mental health providers, where are you going to get them from? And without draining what are typically already understaffed and overburdened mental health systems. And DPO's model is to use volunteers and draw from different medical centers and different community centers so that no one part of the system carries too much of a burden. But that's the kind of pre-disaster issue that you need to deal with, along with what was, I think, quite well put by Dr. Bauer-Stevens in terms of deciding what interventions you're going to do. That's probably actually the first question you need to address going ahead. And then there's the relationship piece, the liaison piece, so that you can be effective. Now, the other part is whatever services, this is my second point, whatever services you do plan as a college, as a university, they need to be integrated into whatever other services are being provided to your students. And again, the examples I've already given of at the Family Assistance Center, we were woven into the tapestry there. And I can assure you that we would not have seen 10,000 rescue and recovery workers if we were not working alongside of our occupational medicine colleagues. That was the magical ingredient to our gaining access to these guys for mental health needs. And so that is a long way of saying that whatever services you do plan out for your students, don't do it in a standalone fashion. If you set up a booth somewhere off to the side that says, come seek out mental health services, I think that can be a problem under normal circumstances. It's definitely a problem under post-disaster circumstances. Third point in the same respect of awareness building and accessibility and destigmatization is planning on some kind of awareness building campaign, publicity campaign, and planning for that before a disaster, as best as assuming communication systems are working, et cetera. But telling people to be thinking about their mental health needs post-disaster from day one, I think, is very important. There's a little bit of research to bear that out, that if you wait too long, you miss a window of opportunity. But also, I think, at least our anecdotal experience in New York of having Project Liberty, the FEMA-funded crisis counseling program, which put a lot of money into billboards and advertisements in our subways, I think that made a big difference. And I do think having a mayor who really found his voice during the post-9/11 period, and who was articulate, always actually was, even before 9/11, about mental health, I think helped us to do a good job. But you can plan for that, I believe. Fourth point, and I'm going to make 8 points, and then we'll stop. Fourth point is that you need to be prepared to be available for the long haul, and you've heard this already, and probably will continue to hear this, but you should be there from day one, and you should ideally be prepared to be there for as long as possible. Early on, the idea, and I think there's research still needs to be done to validate this, but it just makes sense. Early on, you're going to be doing symptom management, helping people ease their distress. You're not going to be diagnosing people with PTSD. You're going to be providing a form of what in various in writings and plans is called psychological first aid, just mending people's spirits, if you will. And there are lots of ways people can mend their spirits after a disaster besides mental health professionals, but we're one part of the equation. And then in the long haul, you're going into more traditional mental health. And I do think, even in a place like New York City, with its celebrated abundance of mental health professionals, if our program were not there, these guys would not be, for the rescue workers, these guys would not be getting mental health treatment. For a host of reasons, again, revolving around ease of access and destigmatization, and just resources. There just aren't enough people to provide services unless you carve them out and say, these are the folks that are going to be keeping an eye on the ball for the long-term mental health needs. I think that that's really crucial. fifth point, much of the psychological burden from disaster from the literature we know is PTSD, major depression, alcohol use problems. A lot of these involve impacting people's ability to concentrate, feel motivated, have a spring in their step, and all that you might expect on a college campus is if your college campus gets back up to speed after a crisis or catastrophe and classes are running, you have to leave some room for potential declines in school performance or at least additional services to help students maintain whatever level of academic productivity they had before, because they may well be laboring under some level of psychological distress that's going to impact on their performance, and we need to take that into account. Another related point, my sixth point, is about alcohol use, alcohol and drug use. I actually would say the alcohol literature is, the literature on this is there's an emerging consensus that disasters don't create new alcohol and drug problems. But what they do is take problems that were there before, and if they were in remission, they're back, or if they were kind of brewing, they're worse. And if you know, I don't work on college campuses, but I know that there's a nationwide concern about alcohol and drug use on campuses. If that was a problem on one's campus beforehand, after a disaster, you can expect that that would be a bigger problem, and plans, I think, should be made accordingly about how you want to address that. My seventh point is also in keeping with what some of the other speakers have said, and that is certain populations of people after disaster can be definitely targeted as being at higher risk for long-term psychological problems, psychiatric problems. There are ways to do that, and I think that would apply to a college campus as well as anywhere else. And part of that is based on pre-disaster characteristics of the individual, prior psychiatric history, how their life was going, you know, psychosocially where their life was at before, and these are things that you can actually identify. Part of it also has to do with exposure and how exposed were they to the event. And exposure is a complicated concept that can be defined in lots of different ways. You know, did you lose loved ones? Was your property damaged? But there's also other factors: financial impact, disruption in whether your classes were canceled, etc. More highly exposed individuals, of course, are going to be more likely to suffer problems. And I think if you have limited resources to address mental health needs, those are the sorts of groups that you can be targeting. And also you can think about psychosocial supports. Those who have less psychosocial supports are going to, that's probably the biggest factor in helping people to recover post-disaster is what's there for them. If you have students from out of town, they may have a problem. If you have students living off campus who are not woven into the fabric of your campus, they too may be at risk, and so you want to think about that. And my eighth point, and I actually just thought of the ninth, but I'll get to my eighth. My eighth point is that I think it is actually possible in terms of identifying people in need to do basic surveys of your student body. I think it logistically is possible, depending upon whether classes resume, whatever the circumstances of how your campus is affected by disaster. There are ways to do brief mental health questionnaires, screenings that I can envision being 10 or 12 questions that you could distribute in classes, distribute in mailboxes, put online, etc., to help people think about what they're going through and to help them even, quote, score it to get a better sense of whether they are more highly in need of services. And I think that that's really important too, because post-disaster there are so many competing priorities, many of them tangible. Where am I going to live? Am I going to continue in my classes? How am I going to pay for this, X, Y, and Z? That mental health in all of its intangible form, you need to do as much awareness building and case identification effectively. And I think you can use paper and pencil surveys in some form or another to identify them. And lastly, and then I'll be done, I would just add that we actually, after 9/11, relied very heavily on students, medical students in this case, to be volunteers with us. They weren't necessarily doing psychiatry, but they were providing administrative support and help, practical needs to our organization, dozens of them. We did a study of them about 6 months after their involvement, and they were exposed in various ways to some awful stuff, awful emotional stuff, and found that many of them had higher levels of depressive anxiety symptoms than you might otherwise expect. On the other hand, the overwhelming majority felt more motivated, more emboldened in their medical careers, etc. And that's a very long way of echoing what several people said today, and that is engaging your student body and being part of the disaster response would be, I think, should be part of your planning as well, to the extent that they can be. It's good for the recipients of their services, and it's good for the student body's morale and well-being. And at the same time, you need to sort of take care of them because they too may be affected in various ways by their work. Thank you very much.
Our last speakers on the panel will be Reg Williams and Bonnie Hagerty. And not that you shouldn't pay attention to what they're saying, but remember that to fill out cards with questions, we'll collect them, and we should have between 15 and 20 minutes, hopefully, to field the questions, maybe try and summarize them and get the panel to respond. Reg and Bonnie will talk on terrorism as a mental health team. And Reg is a professor in the School of Nursing and Psychiatry in the medical school as well at the University of Michigan. His area of research is depression and stress and has been funded by the Department of Defense Tri-Service Research Program for Intervention with Navy recruits at risk for depression. Along with Bonnie Hagerty, they presented a course on the psychosocial effects of bioterrorism for public health practitioners across the state of Michigan. Bonnie Hagerty is Associate Professor, School of Nursing, and Adjunct Clinical Nurse Specialist in the Department of Psychiatry, University of Michigan's Depression Center. Dr. Hagerty has had experience in crisis intervention with the American Red Cross disaster team and was an original member of the Washington County, Michigan Critical Incident Stress Debriefing Team. Her clinical work and research has focused on recurrent depression and patient self-management of their illness. In addition, she's collaborated with Reg on the research investigating Navy recruits' responses to stress during recruit training. It's my pleasure to have knowing them for many years, but I've never really heard them formally present, so it's my opportunity as well.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I've noticed, as sort of typical of University of Michigan classes, is that you all are sitting in the back. This gets a bit of a problem, see, because now I have to project. So guess what this gets you? A quiz. So here it is. What do you get when you combine the following? 4/7 of Terrier, plus 2/5 of Oregon, plus 2/7 of Isthmus, and 1/10 of Management. All right, now think about it. Your grade depends on it now. Are you ready? The answer is? Oh, you're so smart. How many got it right? Guess what you get to do? Move down to the front. No, I'm serious. I'm just kidding. In short, what you do get is the psychosocial issues related to bioterrorism, the CD that Bonnie and I did as the course that Ken mentioned to you, that we did across the state of Michigan on the psychosocial effects of bioterrorism. So what we're about to talk about today sort of is related to what we presented in that all-day course. Well, you can see that bioterrorism and terrorism is really a mental health term. In large part, it terrifies victims. That's the whole principle of what a terrorist is attempting to do, is just terrify everyone around. And so the psychological injury far exceeds the physical. You know, certainly people die from terrorist acts, but the sheer fear that is created from that terrorist act has long-lasting and profound effects. Not knowing what might come next, sort of that fear without a conscious object is profound in a terrorist act. Well, Bonnie and I developed a model that really was sort of the foundation of the course that we taught. And as you've heard throughout the presentation of the last 2 days, is how much effect that a traumatic event has, whether it be a natural disaster or whether it be a terrorist act, has an effect on individuals, children, families, the community. And probably since 9/11, there's been that threat sitting out there. There's always that threat sitting in the back of your mind of one possible event occurring. And then, guess what? An event occurs. And then threats follow even that event, because is it going to happen again? Will it happen the next few minutes? Will it happen tomorrow? Etc. That has then short-term responses. That then continues more threats, and then that can have long-term responses. And certainly when you look at the literature and the research that has been done on terrorism, you can see the effect that it has both short-term and long-term. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. When you look at the magnitude of effects, on the short-term level, you can see that what can happen is there can be anywhere from minimal effects to heading for real trouble, or as months pass, individuals can get into very serious effects. And that is on the short term. But if you look on the right, now you see what can be long-term effects. And certainly some of the research that's been done has been showing that individuals may only have a transient stress reaction or minimal impairment. That affects about 9%. Well, that's not a small number, but it's not a huge number either. But yet you see in terms of moderate impairment, now you're looking at 52%. So a little over half of individuals are going to have a moderate effect long term. And then you can have up to 23% of severe impairment and 16% with very severe impairment. So those are the magnitudes of effect that can occur in a terrorist act. Well, you've heard the word stress and stressors throughout the conference. And we thought we'd take just a moment to just go back and really define those again, because I think sometimes they become elusive as to what we really mean. Well, a stressor are, some event or a tragedy or a loss. And it can also be an internal demand that occurs when an individual experiences a stressor. And you can see that it can be either real or imagined. And that is very true with terrorist acts, is that what is imagined can be far exceed what is actually real. Well, then when we talk about stress, this is really the person's response. And this is where what they usually do to cope doesn't tend to work. And anxiety increases. And so that's the typical response to a stress. Or, a stressor. And then the people respond to stressors differently. This is very true. And they can even respond differently to the same stressor. So recognize that there is no perfect pattern here in terms of what you see in individuals. Well, what influences it? Well, it's the perception. How the person perceives this event has so much to do with how it will influence them. And as Dr. Charney mentioned yesterday, in terms of describing the components of resilience, you can see the importance of social support and perceived availability of help and those kinds of things that individuals experience as support to help them cope with this stress that they are under. And also how they coped in the past. What did they learn from their coping strategies? But generally speaking, when an individual experiences a terrorist act, this is not something that they've ever experienced before. So they don't have a lot to call on in that sense. So this is a whole new learning environment for them in the sense of what they're going to experience. Well, I will turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Dr. Bonney, to tell you more about what this is all about.
First, I want to say that when we're talking about terrorism, we're talking about something that's different from a natural disaster. We're talking about something that's different even from a man-made disaster. And you've heard about the different types of disasters and crises during the past 2 days. We're talking about human beings intentionally trying to kill large numbers of other human beings, which adds, I think, a different edge to what is happening. So what happens when we're exposed to stressors, when we're exposed to a terrorism event? You've also heard over the past few days that people respond differently based on a lot of variables, culture, ethnicity, religion, gender, family. And I think one of the interesting things that Dr. Galea presented yesterday morning was his research where he looked at the Palestinian and Jews and what was going on in the Middle East. And what he found is that there were 3 times more mental health problems with the Palestinians than with the Jews, and trying to understand that in terms of the social fabric. So it's influenced by a lot of different factors. Stress responses, response to a stressor is multidimensional. It's a complex response. It's not just, you demonstrate this, or you're upset emotionally, or you start having some physical things going on. We usually see a very complex response. I'm technologically impaired here, so we're a little behind. Okay. We see the physiologic response, and you've heard about some of this in terms of the HPA axis, the stress axis, being triggered by the fear, by the terror, by the anxiety of what's going on. And in turn, you see things happen like the stimulation of the autonomic nervous system and the sweating and the increased heart rate, the increased blood pressure. And you also see the neuroendocrine responses that occur. For example, the pumping out of cortisol. So we have some physiologic effects that are going on. Then you see the emotional responses. And you've heard about this for the past 2 days. People are in shock. People are just numbed. People can be angry. People can feel depressed. And often what you see in the beginning is people just feeling overwhelmed. What's going on here? And emotionally just not able to deal with things. Powerlessness is something else you've heard about over the past 2 days. What can I do here? Other symptoms you may see, responses, have to do with cognition. And you see people being confused, having difficulty making decisions, not being able to concentrate, having memory impairment. What just happened? I can't remember what I was doing. And a decrease in executive functioning. That's our organization, our planning, our getting up in the morning and trying to figure out, okay, what do I need to dress for today? What am I going to be doing? And just an example of that, and it wasn't a terrorism event, but a number of years ago I got a call early in the morning that my sister-in-law, who had lived with us for a while, had been killed in an automobile accident in Washington, D.C. And I didn't know what to do. I just stood there and I thought, well, we have to get to Washington, D.C. I was in Chicago at the time. And I couldn't figure out how to get from Chicago to Washington, D.C. So I called my mother in New York, and I said, how do we get from Chicago to Washington, D.C.? And the thinking, the decision-making was just absolutely gone at that moment. What I want to do is I want to show you one of the case studies, the videos that we showed during this 2-day presentation that we gave for the public health people in Michigan. And I'm going to try to do this here. My technological advisor. Did you have? And I apologize, we can't bring the whole picture up, so you're going to have to look at this up in the right-hand corner.
Sit down. Sure. Well, I'm fine.
It's been in a restaurant that's just been bombed.
I'm fine. We were just talking and drinking coffee, and I get out with the girls, and I just keep drinking coffee, and my bladder isn't what it used to be, and so I gotta go to the bathroom all the time, and I got up and I walked away from the table, and the waitress was she was bringing the check, and she walked by me. It's my turn to pay. We like to trade up, so I need to get my purse if I can get my purse and take care of the check. And my purse was at the table next to me. Little, it's black. But my phone's in it, and I need to call. Katie's girls were still at school, and she mentioned she needed to pick them up, so I should call. They go to school. I know this. The younger one, she's about 6 or 7, Lynn, and she goes to the elementary school on the new one. We all didn't go to that elementary school. We went to the one across the block, but Lynn was at Briar, I think. Yeah, and the older girl, she's in junior high now, so she's at the junior high, and someone should see that they get home. I can pick them up. I have my car here. I parked at the back of the parking lot, so it's okay. I think it's the Jeep. It's green. Is it all right? I mean, can I drive? I can get them. I know what they look like, and I think I remember what their password was, and they know me. They'll go home with me. That'll be fine. If you could just find my purse with my keys and my phone, I should call in advance and let them know. And I should call some Bob and Bill and Jim, their husbands, and get Robbie. Robbie's Rhonda's baby, and he's not a baby anymore. He's 16 or 17. He's driving now. She was talking about him. And see that I get that bill, because it's not their fault. We come here all the time, and nobody knew anything was going to happen. I mean, they should still get paid. We had, I had a big cheeseburger and fries, and Rhonda had a steak. She never eats steak, but she felt like steak, and so I should really make sure that they get taken care of too. No, I don't need any water. I'm fine. I'm just gonna sit here for a little while, and then I'll go home. It's okay. Thanks.
This was a situation where the woman had been out to lunch with her friends, and she got up, she went to the ladies' room, and when she was at the back of the restaurant in the ladies' room is when the bomb went off and her friends were killed. And you can see what difficulty she was having cognitively in trying to figure out what's happened here, what's going on, I need to pay the bill, can I drive? And if you pick up the CD that's out in the lobby of this, we have other scenarios you can look at that shows people's reactions to terroristic events. We also see interpersonal social responses. People withdraw. People can become very clinging. People can become very disconnected. And you, again, heard from different speakers how relationships are affected, and marital troubles begin, and people are cut off from their communities. I mean, people who lived in the neighborhood of the World Trade Center, many couldn't go back to their apartments. So communities are disrupted. Spiritually, we see people questioning why. Why did this have to happen? Trying to understand and give meaning to this. People use religion as coping. I know a lot of people right after the World Trade Center incident that evening went to church, and people were lighting candles in church. And it was a way people were trying to deal with this event. And then you see damage to people's personal belief systems. Why did this happen? Why did Allah allow this to happen? I just can't believe anymore. The point is that all these types of responses that you've heard about, that we've discussed, people need to know that they're normal and that they're expected in response to the stressors, that they're normal and they're expected. Now, this seems very simplistic, but you've also heard about how it's the simple things right after an event that seem to make such a difference to people, the simple things. I remember on the CISD team, when we would do debriefings with people, we did debriefings with first responders, and when they heard that it's normal for the first few days, that you can't sleep, that you're having problems with your appetite after you've pulled 2 charred children out of the house that's burned, they're relieved to hear that they're not losing it, that these symptoms will begin to lessen over time, and that it's okay, and that other people are experiencing similar kinds of things. The most common stress symptoms that we do see after terrorist attack, after disaster, we see sleep disturbance. People have a hard time falling asleep, staying asleep. Appetite. People can't eat. People feel sick to their stomach. Anxiety. Dreams. People dream about the event. People see it happening over and over again in their dreams. And feeling overwhelmed. Oh my God, I just can't cope with anything. And avoidance. How many people after the World Trade Center avoided going up in tall buildings? I bet that happened to some of you. After the London train bombings last year, I thought, oh my gosh, if I go to London, I'd be a little hesitant to get on the subway system. So we think about avoidance. Planes. Did any of you just hop right on a plane after 9/11? I don't like planes anyway, but I really didn't like planes for a while after 9/11. Time? Okay. So over time, these symptoms will diminish, and for others, as you have heard, that these are going to continue and may worsen with time. And we go back to the original model, and we talk about how there's the event and the threat continues. There's the short-term response. What do we do immediately? How do we save lives? How do we protect ourselves? The threat continues, and then there's the longer-term response. In New York, people were worried. In the United States, we were worried, when is this going to happen next? Is it going to follow quickly? Is it going to happen this year? And we hear on the radio or on TV, oh my God, we just got a message that we should be on higher alert for something to happen. And then you live in a place like the Middle East where you are on alert for these things to happen almost on a daily basis. And I think of the bus bombings that were going on in Israel. I mean, every day you go and you get on a bus and you don't know what's going to happen. And so how do you respond to that? Do you forever stay off of buses? Or do you say, we've got lives to live and we have to get on with it? And you go and you get on the bus and you go to work. So people have long-term responses as well. We have long-term responses in terms of our systems, in terms of, look what we did with planes, and we reinforced the cockpit doors, and we put in all of these elaborate security systems that you have to go through. So communities and societies, as well as individuals, have long-term responses to terrorist events. Again, just to reinforce that most people come through this and function fine. Very few people actually go on to have very severe impairment. But the thing I want to comment on is when Dr. Tucker talked about the fact that people can look okay 6 and 7 years out, but when they're talking about the event or when they're exposed to another trauma, there were actual some physiological changes that happened. So people can look okay and go on over time and function well, but they're prone to re-traumatization when another event happens. People being in a war, having more serious reactions to the Oklahoma City bombings. So even though people can go on and function and they don't develop diagnoses according to the DSM-4, you see people over time, it's like you have to find a place for that event in your head in terms of how to make sense of it and decide how to go on with your life. Okay, so are we on time? We're up for questions.
I can either walk around or take cards. Do you want to take the cards, Ken, or do you want me to read the questions?
Whatever you like to.
Dizzy from,
Hi there. In many cases when we have disasters, we have a lot of people responding, volunteering to respond. How much of that is their reaction to trying to control an uncontrollable situation and being helpful, and how much of that I'm being helpful helps inoculate them from having problems in the future or lessening the problems in the future? Does that make sense?
And that's a good question. I think the act of helping can be a good defense mechanism, can be protective to some degree as long as one is not, re-traumatizing oneself with something that's overwhelming. But gaining a sense of mastery and control, I think, is a big part of it. And I think just the altruistic desire to help other people is another part of it. I think a lot of people who volunteered actually did very well in our community. So.
And you might recall yesterday, Dr. Charney talked about altruism, and that would be very fitting to what you were asking.
I want to follow up on that. I was very struck. This is Jim Abelson here. I've got the microphone. I was very struck by the data from Oklahoma City showing this preserved psychophysiological reactivity 7 years later, and I wonder if that might not, in fact, be a marker of those who are at risk for PTSD after the next trauma, and if there might be a simple way to establish trauma history and measurement of heart rate response to recital of your own trauma history on the volunteers before you put them back into those trauma situations.
I think it does speak to, maybe we should in a way screen people before we throw them really into the midst of horrific scenes in disaster. And I think we didn't do that, and I don't know if other disasters are kind of looking at credentials a little more, but the physiologic reactivity, we're not really sure. We wanted to kind of look at this optimistically as, maybe these people really had very low rates of PTSD and PTSD symptoms, so we kind of chose to look at that as mostly getting ready for a future disaster. This group, they may be more subject to problems over time, and it would be interesting. I think we know who these folks are. It'd be nice to follow them and see what happens should there be another tornado. We've had a subsequent F5 tornado after the bombing, but we don't really know. We could look at it as if the glass is half empty or half full, and we sort of chose to look at it as if it's half full. but only time will tell. We looked at some of the actual interviews of the people who had strong physiologic responses and low symptom levels, and it was really fascinating. One person said that they started going to church 3 times a week, which they had never done before, and they tried real hard to forgive McVeigh and try to do better. So that person did well. So why some people can cope in a positive way, I don't know. But that's a good question about what does the physiologic reactivity mean. I don't know.
And I would add, I think it's, considering physiologic reactivity, but in general, I think there is a way to establish sort of fitness for duty for volunteers, just as in potentially in other work settings it's possible. I think it's a dodgy and politically charged issue when you just need volunteers to do something, and you also don't want to turn away people who are well-intentioned. But I think that whether with physiologic reactivity, I guess, is an open question, but there are other issues of personal characteristics, personal experience that you can look for that will identify people who are more likely to be good for the volunteer response and that it will be good for them as well.
And I just want to say that we're talking about volunteers, but there are health professionals too who may not be in the best positions because of their history, et cetera, to actually be part of an event like that. And sometimes people know it, and often they don't. And these include people who are in psychiatry or primary care or any specialty area, nurses, physicians, et cetera. So just because you're a health professional doesn't mean that you're, quote, fit to deal with a situation like that.
I have a question here for Dr. Hagerty, which is whether you could comment on gender difference in responding to stress.
Dr. Galea talked about this a little bit yesterday, and I think he gave a good presentation about that. One of the things we know is that men and women are different in terms of how they respond. There's been some research, actually, that was done by Susan Nolan-Hoeksema, who was on the faculty here a short time ago, and I believe she's at Yale now. And she talked about the fact that women seem to deal with it with more rumination and thinking about it and, oh my God, and what happened and what's going on here, whereas she found that men dealt with it more in a problem-solving kind of mode, such as, okay, this happened, what do we have to do now, what do we have to do next, and let's just deal with the situation as it's happening. And that's, I think, just one example of the kinds of differences through research people have been finding.
I guess this is to anyone on the panel, but what are the psychological consequences of the Department of Homeland Security's terror alerts and their announcements?
In Oklahoma City, every time the terrorist alert goes from whatever color to red or orange, people kind of are in ready alert, I think. And, I don't know that anybody doesn't travel when that happens, but I think there's a sensitization to the even possibility of terrorism in our community. I don't know that it helps anything for us.
And it definitely stirs the pot if you, let's say, have PTSD from 9/11 and then a terrorist alert goes up. A lot of our patients, any kind of news occurrence of that ilk can really stir the pot for them. I'm not sure if that means it shouldn't happen, but it can definitely make pre-existing problems worse for some people.
What do you know about mental health responses to terrorism in countries that have experienced a long history of terrorist activity? Are there differences in the way people in those countries respond?
I think there's some suggestion in Northern Ireland that many people became maybe desensitized and that they sort of were able to maintain their life around the bombings and just they got on with their life. It's not that they took risks. I think, I don't know, in Israel there's a lot of research that's looked at the civilian population still having anxiety with the ongoing bombing. So I think there's a variety of findings. If any of you have more information on that.
I don't think there's been a consistent sort of conclusion on the subject, but you can well imagine that thinking in terms of exposure, repetitive exposure may well make you a bit tougher, but also is going to, over time, potentially just wear upon your defenses, etc. But I don't think, despite that, it's a fantastic question, and that the research is consistent or abundant enough to completely answer it.
Some time ago, there was a study done looking at depression in Lebanon. And when you think about what happened in Lebanon in terms of the civil war that was going on there for a number of years, and there was the question in terms of were these high rates of depression related to what people had gone through on a constant basis in terms of their stress in response to the civil war that was going on.
If I might, there's a Knight Wallace fellow who was here last year. Was a cinematographer for CNN and had constantly gone back to war zones. And I asked her a question exactly how she did that, and she said, "Well, it's like, in some way, it's like going to a new place. You have to kind of scope out what's safe." And so that you operate, at least initially, in the area that you think is safe, and then you expand that. And I believe that happens in a disaster, no matter where it is, natural terrors or otherwise. That what happens is you have to kind of reformulate what's safe and what's not safe in your world, and it probably starts off very small, and hopefully it grows, and hopefully it grows, and it's reinforced by safety. And one might think about the people who can't move out and can't begin to excavate areas of safety are also the people that will ultimately become our patients. So there's a redefinition of how one operates, but again, speaking about resilience, that people are exceptionally creative about how they're able to redefine and to continue to do the things that they need to do that constitutes for them a life, perhaps not the life that it was before the disaster, but nonetheless a life.
I have one more question here, which I think is for Dr. Tucker. Were victims involved in constructing or planning the memorial, and how helpful was that in their healing?
I'm sorry, I don't have a lot of information on that. I think there was a board of individuals from the community who helped to choose the panel or the actual memorial. The artist, I don't recall who was, but yes, there was some community involvement in that selection. I think that's healing as well. There's a memorial museum. A lot of times volunteers or people who have been personally affected. So I think that becomes a positive thing.
Those are the questions that I have.
So there is an afternoon session that it will resume at 1:00.